if you're good to go, then I'm going to start this thing.
Let's do it.
All right. We're going live. Oh, we are live. Yes, so we are. Welcome everybody to this review for week 6. And with me today are both Helen and Seth from Operation Fistula. Welcome, both of you. Excited to have you on.
Excited to be here, as always.
Cool.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yes, and we are going to start with a bit of a discussion of the data set because I personally struggled. I imagine some people in the Makeover Monday community maybe struggled understanding how to tackle this data. So while I know everyone's super keen to have as many visits reviewed and given feedback on as possible, I think this is a really good point to actually, let's take a step back and talk about the data, because there's also a question, I think, of data ethics and and biases and how we approach the data that we're working with this week. So let me switch over to data.world where we have the data set, and I hope you all had a chance. So there's obviously the viz, but also the supporting material, and the info pack is super helpful in understanding the question here and what the data is about. And then also the Focus 2030 report that was published where the data came from. And what I want to do, because I think the viz might be a bit small on the screen, is let me get back to this report and actually bring it up on the screen and a bit larger. So we can talk about the question that the data seeks to answer. And I will let you both actually chip in here. So I'll bring this up on the screen. This is the question we're looking at. Thinking about the list of reasons below, which, if any, do you personally think are the main reasons why women may not be equal to men in your country? And I struggle to understand what they actually mean by that. And before I hand over to Seth and Helen, I want to say what I thought this means. And I have two opinions. One could be, hey, in your country, women are not treated equally to men. What are the reasons for that? Or do you think women are not equal to men? And are these the reasons why? So one to me is, what are you observing in your country, whether you agree with it or not? And the other one is, what do you think about men versus women? And that's why I haven't done my viz yet, because I didn't know how to start. And I'm really keen, Helen and Seth, for you guys to give us your perspectives on how should we understand this question, because I think it definitely changes the perspective of a viz.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, well, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have Helen on, just so we have a little balance, because I think there's perspective, right? I mean, there's different perspectives that everybody's going to have on where we as a society, as a global community, sit on the spectrum of equality. And I mean, from my perspective, I think first, I think there's just a built-in assumption here, which I think is accurate, is that we have not yet achieved gender equity, or equality in really any country. And I think so. Underlying that, my feeling about this is it's why you perceive that inequity still persists. That's kind of how I see it. Now, I think to talk a little bit about the data too. I mean, we have data from over 17,000 respondents that are basically 1,000 people from each of the 17 countries, and these are not like representative of the whole world. It's 17 rich countries. The survey could only really be done over the internet because it's been happening throughout our COVID pandemic. So it's also skewed more towards people who have internet access. So, like you're getting certainly not a representative sample of like how people in these communities really feel about this. So in some ways it's incomplete. But from our perspective, this was like a data set that kind of captured the various breadth of like what we've done over the last year with this fund. But let me just pause for a second and see what Helen thinks about it.
Yeah, so I think just to build off what you've both already said, I think that in a survey like this, so there were 23 questions included in the survey, and we were able to select one for this Viz 5. And I think one of the things that I am really pleased that we're having this dialogue around was because I think there is such a lot of sort of implicit and explicit bias throughout the study and throughout the report. So one of, two of them, Seth's just mentioned, the 17 countries were majority high and upper middle income countries. There were only a couple of lower middle income countries included. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the survey having to only happen online, the population specifically in those lower income countries where they would have been able to participate would have been primarily urban and advantaged. So you're already seeing that in those particular countries, you're not necessarily getting a representative sample of the population of the country. So you're not getting a sense necessarily of these perceived obstacles to gender equality. So the other thing that I would say about this, because we've been talking about this behind the scenes about this question and how complex it is and how it has these issues with bias. And one of the things that I discussed with Eva is that it would be so great if we could rewrite the question to be something more like, what are the factors that most contribute to gender inequality in your country? So that it's very specific to where the audience participants are, and it also takes into account that premise of kind of an unequal world, right? Because I think by not making that really explicitly clear in the question, you do start to get into that pitfall that Eva was talking about of whether actually the question could be leading the audience to be surveying kind of their own prejudices and their own biases and their own like internal reasonings as to why they think perhaps men and women are not equal, versus understanding that this is a sort of systems question. Like, what are the systems in your country that are perpetuating gender inequality? So yeah, I think this is a really great dialogue, and I think it raises some important questions for us as a sort of community of data-based people. Is that when you just take the data set and you just think, okay, this is all I'm going to look at, and then I'm just going to visualize it. This is kind of an open invitation to kind of start asking these deeper questions and start having this study. This just came out in January. This is a really there's loads of publicity around the survey, but thinking about the voices that haven't been said, and the people who are not being heard in the responses as well. But yeah, just great to be engaging in all discussion.
And I have to just pause for 1 second because people have said we've had really bad echo. I don't hear any echo, but I've just looked at my streaming software, and forgive me, I'm not an acoustics expert here. So I have just dialed down my desktop audio, and if somebody could confirm, I know there's a bit of a delay, if this is now better, because I think there were a lot of bars just all going a bit crazy. I hope it's better now, because I don't, it's really hard because we all hear each other perfectly fine, but what arrives with the audience is a bit different. So I just want to give people a couple of seconds to say yay or nay, and I might just have to tweak something else. But I think, Helen, you make a really good point about, well, on the one hand, I just think the question is poorly worded. And we just, like you said, we discussed this earlier, and we're like, it could be so simple to, okay, so we sound better now. Okay, good. It could be so easy to change it. I think it's like, oh, what a shame, because, you're putting out the survey, and while it has its limitations with the countries included, it did reach a lot of people, but it's like, oh, how do we interpret this? And also, what was the intention of the people asking the question, but are they the same people interpreting the data? Because if not, then between them, even in the same organization or the same team, there might be a difference, right, of how this is analyzed. So I think it's a really valid point. So I'm keen for us to have a look at what people...
If I may, one thing I think is really important here is, this is really an evolving exercise, right? Trying to understand the barriers and limits that keep us from realizing our, inborn equality. We are all. I mean, if you look at kids on the playground, they're behaving completely. This is learned stuff. It's perceptions drive a lot of the barriers that are here, and so understanding how perception and how human behavior across an infinite level of cultures in different environmental circumstances drive these barriers is it's not easy to do, right? And there's really great people, great organizations trying to answer these questions, and everybody's kind of moving. There's there are some groups, but everybody's kind of moving in silos. And I think one of the things that's just really critical, one of the reasons we did Biz 5 is to try to bring all these different views and organizations and efforts together. And you really make a great point. I mean, imagine if we had a consortium who could have been consulted on, here are the things we're trying to understand, like, here's the questions you're going to ask, like, and the ways to make it stronger. Thinking of the end in mind when you start this, like, here's what we're going to try to see, how do we ask the right questions? I think there would be a great benefit.
And that's I think it's kind of a teaser for where we're going to go with Biz 5. I think there's going to be an opportunity to kind of do that, and to bring some more of these organizations into the fold with some of the experts here from the data fam who really know how to like parse this. Well, what we're trying to get to, what everybody's trying to get to, is like perception drives reality, and if you understand the biases of that perception, where it comes from, how it materializes, then you have a pretty important ingredient to expect.
Okay. Yes, and I'm still dealing with these audio issues, sorry, because so my challenge is I have my own input and I have the stuff from the desktop, which is you guys, and I need to make sure that you're audible. And I hope it's fixed now because they can hear me fine, but then they couldn't hear you fine. And I have 3 different options on my screen, but only 2 of them should be switched on. And I just don't know which one the other one is. But anyway, we'll just have to deal with it. Okay, because I think the desktop audio has to be switched on and maybe the other one switched off. So hopefully, it might echo now. Anyone able to read? Okay, maybe we'll do one more quick test. I'll let you guys speak for just, a few words and stuff so that we can tell whether we're good, and then we can move over to the visitors and get into the review.
Well, I'm excited to look into the business.
Good.
Really. Helen, how about you?
Yeah, me too. I would just, the last thing I would just say is that, we chose this question from the survey specifically because of what Seth was saying around kind of perceptions building the reality of the world that we live in and human behavior, and also the fact that the question, the themes that could be selected by the audience cover so many of the themes and topics we've already explored as a Biz 5 community, unpaid work, the economic empowerment of women, access to education. There were so many of the themes that we've really gone deep on as a community in Biz 5. And so by having that understanding as a baseline, when we come to a question like this, we can actually have these deeper dialogues about what's missing and what's not being represented. So that's where I'll end. I hope you guys can hear me. I'm very excited to see what you guys have been building.
All right, I will move us off the screen and we will finally look at the visualizations, and I'm hoping to get lots of ideas. So I shared with both of you the collection, and for everyone else, so I went through all the visits that have been submitted with the hashtag. I put together a collection of different types of visualizations, maybe how much analysis or how little, what style the charts are, and we're going to go through that from top to bottom, chronological order. And everyone who's not reviewed, please just take our feedback that the stuff we say about everyone else's viz and include the lessons into your own. I do feel like we're repeating a lot every week. So, if you can just address the basics, I would love that. So let's start with the viz by EK Data. And this person is online, I have seen. So let's see what EK has created. I don't know EK's actual name. So we'll see. Gender equality perceptions, can we get there? So let me put that into full screen mode actually. Okay, so Helen is in the chat and is ready to answer any questions if you want to type them out, and we can also address them here. All right, I guess I'll start, but please, Seth, jump in as you wish. My first impression is pink and purple, which kind of, like, for me, it's just, it's not the thing anymore for gender things. I think we've moved past it. This is exactly the biases we're talking about, and I think the stereotypical colors for, pink for girls, blue for boys, just enhances, like, in a bad way, it like enforces the gender stereotypes rather than getting rid of them. So what I would suggest is to really, really rethink colors. And this, again, is something we say every single time, because every time we do this 5, there's pink and blue. So if you use pink, I mean, you know, I can't stop you, but it's always going to be my feedback to not use pink just because it's something about women or girls. I think, maybe approaching it more from a business dashboard angle and thinking about how could I make this look to convince an audience in a very professional, neutral kind of way, because this immediately, I think, puts perceptions into people's heads. Oh, it's about women and girls, and they think about, I don't know, pregnancy, maternity leave, dancing and roses and dolls, rather than, okay, what's the issue that we're actually talking about. That would be my first feedback here, and I want to give some time to Seth to leave his comments as well.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying about the colors. It doesn't bother me as much if it doesn't jump at me. The thing that the first thing I feel when I look at this is there's a lot here. There's a lot of density, you know, there's a lot of words and letters and the colors. So I'm a little overwhelmed by the lack of white space here. And it takes me literally it took me a fair amount of time while you were talking to kind of work out what was happening here. So I think, you know, if you really want to make a clear message, I mean, I think you have to like take away things, you know, there's maybe some stuff that could live in a footnote or somewhere else, but I think, you know, you got to figure out what is that arc, that narrative arc, and how does each thing on the viz contribute to that narrative arc, you know? And I don't feel like that's really happening here. I feel like we're trying to say everything, trying to put everything out there, and in doing so, nothing really comes across, you know?
Yeah. And I think the idea is really good to take text and charts and alternate them to kind of guide the audience through your analysis and your findings. So I really like the approach. I think it just needs to be a bit refined so that it's not overpowering. You add a bit of space, for example, like horizontally between the elements, but also vertically. And then the balance of the size of the text. So I know I always say don't make it too small, but this is almost a bit too big. It looks like it's about 15. I mean, I zoomed in. So yeah, it's probably about 14, 15 point. So maybe tune it down to like 11 or 12. And then the text in the chart is quite small. And I don't know why that text is on those different colored boxes, because like cultural, political, and then employment opportunities, domestic, like the different colors mean different things throughout the viz. I think that's not really helpful. So if you say that, you know, all the purple things are political things, I think that's maybe what it is. But then in the pink box, the first thing says different representation politics. So why is that not political? Why is it cultural? That needs to be consistent. But I think the idea is right to have a bit of a storytelling layout vertically. It just needs a bit of refinement there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like the message here, and it's really shown in the bar chart there, is that, you know, the cultural pieces are the biggest limitation or the biggest barriers. That's kind of what is being said here with that image. But I think and I think that's in the wrong position. I would put that higher up in the, you know, the higher value real estate, and make the title that is the story, right? Cultural barriers prevent quality, and then the rest of it is supporting. But I think one thing you've really nailed it too, Eva, is if you're going to like classify these clusters, you know, with names that have words that are in the descriptions, you can't have like the political be like this mauve color, and then have the first bullet in the cultural be political. Like that just is going to cause, you know, questions and confusion. So what I would say is the lead is a little bit buried here, and I would bring that up more, and I would tone down some of the supporting stuff to like explain why these cultural barriers are probably the thing that's most limiting, at least perceived by this population of survey respondents.
Absolutely. And I think it's always a good idea to start with almost a bit of a summary. So maybe in addition to the title, which could be bigger, having a bit of a subtitle that just is like, you know, this is your stance, or this is what you found. and then maybe some really high level facts like Seth said, the biggest barrier are cultural issues, for example, and then explaining that, because then people are like, okay, like it's almost like when someone tells you something new, they're like, these are the 3 things you need to remember, 1, 2, 3, and then they explain them and they give you reasons and examples, but just start simple and then go into more detail.
Yeah, totally. Just like writing, like the first bit of the paragraph kind of gives you the summary, the rest supports it, rather than have all the supporting and then burying the lead.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to Irene, and I'm just trying to find, okay, so there's a link in a couple of responses down from her tweet, and this looks like I think she said her second Makeover Monday dashboard. So welcome, Irene. Great to have you join this review. And I'm just going to zoom in. All right, so it's not pink and blue, it's red and blue, which I think I'm okay with because it is easily recognizable. If it was like blue for women and red for men, I would probably be like, oh, it's using the same colors but the other way around. That makes it hard for people to understand. But I think I'm okay with those. The only challenge is that in the US there are very political connotations with those 2 colors, especially with the US politics being so prevalent in the media for the last, I don't know, forever years. And but here, so we've got a map and we've got a diverging bar chart that looks like it's been, the axes are fixed so that they're the same, they're in proportion, which is good. I'm just trying to kind of figure out my way through this. So what are the main perceived obstacles for gender equality? I like the title because I think it kind of boils down the question to the essence of what it actually wants to get across.
Yeah, absolutely. It like starts you in the journey of the story, right? Like, what is it? And then the images right below immediately kind of show you that it's really different in every place, right? It's like that's because you have these clusters of different icons. If you go over them, they're explaining what they are, and so that kind of starts to let you see that it really depends. It really depends. The one thing that you do have to deduce a little bit, and I guess that's kind of what the chart below shows, is like in which places is it differing? Like, is it just looking at, like, for example, at South America, you can see in Colombia, it's women think about employment opportunities and so do men, right? So that's like, there are some places where there's more parity, where people consider the same main thing. I think that's really interesting. And if you look at, what I think the chart below is aggregating it, right? So it's like looking and see where there may be, crossover across the entire group, which I think is less interesting than this idea of, it's really different in different places, and men and women perceive it differently in some places and the same in some places. So when you put these these charts with the icons on it, that's the story I'm starting to find, right? And then the next piece to me doesn't support that story. It's talking about. I mean, I don't, or at least I can't see immediately how it might be. I probably need to think about it a little more.
So I like the idea of the map, which is probably a surprise for many people because I'm not a fan of icons that could make it look a bit gimmicky. What I would suggest, because to me, house is probably okay for share of domestic duties. Religion and culture, hard to identify, and it looks like a couple, but it's children treated differently. So those icons are not immediately clear to me. What I would suggest, because the maps are next to each other, is to make the icon explanations in the middle between the maps. So I don't constantly have to jump down and back up and down and back up to kind of understand, what was it again? But I like the idea of showing which one is the main obstacle, because it does show that difference in the different, between the genders, what their perception is. And then, Seth, you said that the bottom chart doesn't really break it down the country difference. So what Irene could do is have a dashboard action so that if I click on share of domestic work for women, highlight in the map above the countries where that is the main obstacle perceived by women, so that you can see which of those countries does it apply to. And again, kind of use the highlight actions or the dashboard actions to show that in the maps, make it dynamic and interactive, because that way you can include a little instruction to say, click on each of these topics to see how the countries differ or something like that. That could overcome that a little bit. But I like the idea of the map. I just don't know how easy it is to see the difference because you always have to look left and right.
But if you click one of the, I just discovered this, it does have a dashboard actually. So if you click one of the icons, it does change that chart for that specific country.
So it's that way around. It's just not in reverse, right?
Yeah. Which I really like this. Because then you can see, like you look at Colombia, for example, where they have they're perceived to be the same, right? The men and women see the barrier as the same, and it's different employment opportunities. And then you look at the chart below, and you can really see that by and large, like they're tracking almost the same. I mean, it looks really, really close, So that's what I think is interesting about that is it starts to show you that you have a place where people are kind of on the same page, right? Like they both agree. So I mean, if you want to address these cultural, these like perception barriers, right? The first thing you have to do is the population has to be on the same page. Like if women think it's one thing and men think it's a different thing, you're not gonna be able to work together to address whatever those issues are because you're gonna both think it's something different. So I think when you have that parity, that's like an opportunity where maybe a country's a little more progressed in its ability to start to address some of these issues. And that's a pretty interesting story. And I think this Viz actually, it does a pretty good job of doing that. And I think if there had been something to say, hey, click this, click an icon to see the breakdown between the country, that might have been helpful to help me get there faster.
There is, but it's a bit hidden. It's between the charts on the right side. I didn't see it either.
There you go. It's a bit.
So I like that action for the reasons you said, and this problem that men and women have a very different perception of how the situation is in terms of equality is probably something I'm going to fight till my dying days. It's extremely frustrating, even in 2021 in the UK and other Western countries where you think we kind of have it figured out, but we don't. What I would suggest is the butterfly chart, while it looks really neat, it makes it really hard to compare. We have the numbers, but they're at the end of the line. So to compare, it would be much easier if the bars were both going in the same direction, because then you could see how much longer is the chart for women, is the bar for women compared to men, or the other way around. That's just one thing. I know it looks really nice and it fits nicely, but a bar chart that has both going in the same direction would make it easier visually for us to compare.
Eva, can we just click Japan real quick? Because I think it's really interesting.
Yes.
Like talk about like being on a different page, right? Like women are saying it's the share of domestic work and men are saying it's employment opportunities. So, it's really, you see, that's a material disparity,
And the irony of that being that women, I would guess, are the ones doing more of the domestic work. So they can really say, yes, this is too much. Whereas men are the ones creating probably a lot of the employment opportunities for women. And they're like, oh, there aren't enough. It's like, it's in your hands. Why don't you do something about it? So
but see, this one is particularly interesting because, right, like if the men are pushing for increased employment opportunities for women who perceive that the share of domestic work is unequal, the women are professionalizing more and still bearing the burden of the unpaid work.
Yeah.
So it's like going to deepen the problem, right?
Yeah.
Rather than, so if that is a representative sample for Japan, like I would say for the gender equality warriors there, you probably want to start to try to change men to understand that that the share of unpaid work is like a pretty important thing to recognize, right?
And one thing I've come to realize through conversations recently is so often the challenge is that we are not listening to each other. That people, everyone has their biases, us all included, and we think it's a certain way, and it's okay for us to think that because, we've been brought up a certain way and we have all these experiences, but we're not listening and we're also not asking questions. If somebody says, this situation is bad for me, we all get really defensive about, oh, well, it's not my fault and I'm doing all of these good things and I treat everyone equally, rather than saying, why do you experience this situation a certain way? I found that people are so quick to defend themselves and to argue against something rather than saying, Oh, tell me more about your experience so I can understand, because it's not about accusing and taking sides. It's really about an open conversation so that people can see, as woke as they might be, they may have missed something and they can make a small change that makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I think as a society, it's not just on this topic. I think the world is not listening to each other right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay. On that note, let's jump to the next viz, which is by Natasha Stevenson. And I'm going to make this nice and big. And this is a nice simple slope chart. My first thought was, okay, so the title is Why Are Women Not Equal to Men?
Yeah, I just say I hate that. I hate that title.
Yes, I do too, because it assumes women are not equal to men.
It's about perceptions, right? Because it's basically, and I think this is kind of the beginning of the call, right? Like the you know, how do you absorb this data, right? It's not that they're not equal. It's that the systems have barriers to letting them realize the equality that they inherently have. So I think that's got to be changed, right? Because that just immediately is a distraction.
Yes, and I think, it's also a language thing where women and men are not the same, but they are equal. They're worth the same. They're capable of many of the same things, and they should have they should have equal rights, and they should experience them in whatever uniqueness they have. But I agree, the title needs to change. And then what I actually also have an issue with is the subtitle says, in general, this is they did the survey. Here are the responses they received, but there is no response. It's a percentage of respondents, but it doesn't tell me anything. I mean, it's just lines, and I can see Japan is the country, and there are lines female, male, but there are no responses. If you promise me responses, I expect words. At least naming, for example, the things that are at the top that are colored in blue. This promises something it doesn't deliver. So, keen to hear your view.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the wording, I agree with you. I think it's what I think the thing here is it's a really quick visual way to see the parity in perception or the lack of parity, right? So it's starting with Japan. Whatever's higher up on this chart is like, what most people think is the problem. And if you have a massive slope in that line, the slope should be close to zero if you have parity of perception, right? But if you have a massive slope in either direction, you have like one side thinking there's a different problem than the other. And that's like funny as Japan, because that's exactly what we're focusing on.
Yeah, exactly.
But like if you look at Colombia, for example, where if you look at Colombia, right, the highest thing it's almost a flat line, which is great, right? So you have this like the stories of Japan and Colombia. I think as a visual, I think this is pretty cool, because you can see these in a really quick sense by the slope of a line and where it sits on that vertical spectrum. You get an immediate understanding of the disparity of perception or lack of it, right? Because as look at all of Colombia just for a second, like everything is pretty much flat except for the second one, which is women thinking that unpaid care is important and men not understanding that. And there you go, same problem as Japan. And if you guys remember, we did a Viz 5 on unpaid work, and of all the things we did, that's the one that hit me the most, because we're all in COVID now, and this has been really unfair, particularly against women. And we got into this whole thing with fair play, with this book, Fair Play. And so, I think as you go through this more, you see that that's a big deal, right? This unpaid work, men don't understand. They don't understand it. They don't understand it unless, and maybe more so now, but I think with COVID, but it's just something that we broadly have not been able to grasp.
And I find that so interesting, because when I was a kid, my mom had cut out of a newspaper this like cartoon / kind of joke, and stuck it on the kitchen cabinet, and it was a woman, like all these different panels of all the work the woman did. She had like twins, and she was doing the laundry and feeding the kids and tidying the house and all these things. And at the end of the day, the man comes home with his his suitcase from work, and he's like, oh my God, you're so lucky you don't have to work. And it's exactly that point. And this was 25 years ago. And it really, obviously I still remember it, even though I was a kid back then, not really thinking much about it. And yes, it's so invisible. And it's interesting that that's the one slope here, looking at Colombia. Now, coming back to the viz, one suggestion I want to make to actually fix some of the wording is, instead of saying here are the responses they received, you could just say, you can explore the responses below, because that helps people understand, okay, I might not see any words, but I can explore them, and then you could say, hover over each line to see the different, situations or something people were asked to judge. So that way, because you don't have to change the whole viz. I think it's just the wording needs to be refined, title aside. But yeah, I think this is a good example of make sure that whatever you're promising people in your viz actually is delivered, like they can get the answers they're expecting. Yeah,
but just to Natasha, as like a visual device to tell the story, I think the chart you've used is really useful. Like I mean, I'm going to play with it more myself.
Yeah,
it's really fast to see, with the slope of the line, like how in agreement are people, right, in different countries.
And it just needs to be explained, because for the author, for Natasha, it's probably obvious what it means because she's worked with the data. But just to explain to people, like literally just make it super simple. The chart below shows whether men and women agree. So if the slope goes from bottom left or from left to right in an upward direction, it means that more men agree to the statement than women, and vice versa. Like, you need to explain that, because people don't just automatically understand it. But then they can look at this data and really make sense of it and be like, this is really interesting. Like, we looked at Japan, we looked at Colombia. So you'll get a lot more value for your audience if you help them a little bit along the way.
Totally. And I would basically say, this, in your little text, I would be like, this survey was done. And so to make it easy to understand, like a flat line means people agree.
Yeah.
A diagonal line means that people don't agree. The higher the line, the more, important everybody sees it. So I think that's like, just make it super simple. Don't talk about slope. Don't talk about anything jargony. Just be like flat lines and diagonal lines.
Yeah, exactly. Basically explain it to a layperson. I always want to prefer layperson. I don't want to say grandma, because why does grandma not know about data? Maybe grandma is a data person, right? So just think of lay people, someone who hasn't seen the data, who doesn't know how to interact with it. So next we have Sean. His chart is also interesting. So, okay, let me make this a bit larger. So he's got female and male. I like that he's got the women in the darker color, because we are talking about women not being treated equally. So I guess the focus being on their perspective is interesting to kind of call out. And what I struggled with a bit here was, it says the top 3 largest gaps, but I don't see a gap. I see bars with like a vertical line through them. In your wording again, and I keep talking about the text, but when you say gaps, I expect visually to see a gap. Maybe it could be, like divergence from agreement or something, because these bars diverge from the middle line where there would be complete agreement. I'm keen to hear what you think of this one, Seth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like trying to orient myself on it. Obviously, the first thing you see when you look at all the countries is, again, the unpaid work. I think first putting none of these at the top of the list is like not the proper order. I would order them by the magnitude. And then I kind of pop down to look and see the difference between men and women. So one of the things that I think is lost here is like like when you look at the magnitude of it, if you have something that like women hugely value, like unpaid work, they're at least in aggregate talking about that is 45% is the top sort of thing. Men are 30%. So it does make that look like it's got somehow there's some issue with the scaling of those bars, I think, because it could be skewed by one group having a higher perception. Not that that's, a huge issue, but it's just making me think about, like, are these bars, like, right? Like, if I see unpaid work having this big thing, I think that's like a big gap, right? And yes, it's number one for women and number three for men. But yeah, now I feel like I'm
because it says the width shows the number of responses, but that's not really all that useful. It should be more, okay, out of all the responses, like, it should be the percentage maybe, so that they can all be compared more equally. I know that, you've got the different sample sizes, but if you want to compare them, it should be, okay, out of the sample, how many, what's the percentage, rather than the numbers, because the numbers are different for each country. I also think, again, here, we need an explanation of how to read the chart. Make it accessible for lay people. The Focus 2030 report obviously is written for kind of anyone. And if you think that anyone could pick this up and you don't have a chance to explain it in person, what would they need to know? So rather than saying middle divider is the midpoint, width shows the number of responses, literally put it into, like, full sentences. These are, I don't know, top 3 answers or whatever they are. And, like, whatever. I mean, I can't even say it because I don't understand it, but and that is a problem. But explaining it to people is important. Don't be afraid to put words in your viz. It doesn't have to be just charts and numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll move on because we are going to run out of time soon. But I think having those conversations about the data is really important because we don't often do that. And I think it helps people understand stuff better, especially understanding our critique better. And I know that Michelle, I think she's tuned in, and I want to make sure we review her viz because she always, puts a lot of effort into these, but also because she's been on this side of the table in January, and so I want to make sure it's a bit of a giving back to give her some feedback here. Keen to hear, if you had a chance to look at this yet, what do you think of Michelle's visualization?
Yeah, I'm working through it right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot to take in, like to figure it. I'm figuring out what the story is. One of the, I just in general, I'm not a huge fan of, like, a lot of text in the earlier parts of it. I get it that it's probably like trying to sequentially order, like you're sequentially informing someone about like, what's coming. But to me, it's kind of like putting the credits at the beginning of a movie somehow. Like, I feel like I want to know the big story here. So as I get to it, I'm like, the way it's formatting on my thing too, there's the highest percentage for any response on the left. It's 60% for Japan and female about unpaid work, but weirdly, just the way it's formatting on my computer, the last word in that description of unpaid work is men, and it says 60%. Like, so it's like, I was confused. I'm like, men in Japan, 60%, because I've seen the data. So I don't know if that's loading on yours the same way. Yeah, it looks like it is on the YouTube thing. But I don't know if you can even do anything about that. But it's just like a weird little thing there. And then the other stuff I'm like trying to work out what it is, so I'm not really quite sure yet. Let me just have a look. Maybe you can give your thoughts while I look at this last one.
I agree with the text, and the German in me says, oh yeah, give me all the credentials first so that I know that, this is all valid stuff before I dive deeper into it. I mean, Germans love like a big introduction before we build this whole, I don't know, like tension before we get to the end result. But I know that in an Anglo-Saxon context, it's more common to be like, here's the Big Bang, and now let me unravel it. And I think starting with the Big Bang in today's times of short attention spans and clicks and people disappearing very quickly, it's good to maybe introduce one key finding up front, then the text, and then have more of the details. So if you can say, did you know that XYZ? Or maybe, out of the, I don't know, like some interesting snippet, such as, the men in Japan or the women in Switzerland and what they said. So
Yeah. So if I can just say something about this, like the chart here below, I think that I would transpose the whole thing, okay? Because the way it's structured right now is you have female and male, and then you have countries by row and topics by column, okay? But if I go to Japan and unpaid work, right, at the far right, I know that 60% of women think this is a big deal. And then if I immediately go down that line, I'm like, oh, 43%, but that's not, that's the country of men who thought that that was the biggest issue, which is Switzerland, right? And weirdly, Switzerland and Japan are literally opposites, right? Like and you realize that from this view, but mostly I don't think you're going to be comparing like how, I think somebody's going to want to know like how the men and women within a country compare to each other rather than how the countries compare to each other on a topic, you know?
Yeah, it should be within the country, right? Because you want to know men and women within a culture or within a country rather than, I mean, I wouldn't compare Argentina and Germany. It's so different. So
really different, you know. And I think if you have what, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like 10-ish topics or whatever, and 17 countries. So you could affect the same kind of visual and be a little more crowded, maybe a little skinnier, but you could do the same thing where then you could look for any topic and you could see how a country compares for that topic, you know, from men and women. I don't know if it would work, Michelle, but I don't know. When I look at this, like the thing that I would want to do with that, I can't do because I'm like it's making you compare how countries are to each other rather than how countries are within themselves.
Yeah, and maybe what could be done is you have the topics. I just call them topics, or the responses on rows, vertically, and then you just have men and women as bars next to each other so you can compare them immediately. But you just pick a country, and maybe optionally you can pick a second country if you do want to compare them. So let's say we have Switzerland, and I can see, okay, across all the different questions, this is how men and women compare. If I want to compare Switzerland and China, I can select China as a second country and have them in, two separate charts, but I can just visually kind of jump across and be like, oh, that's really interesting. Or I just focus on one country. But I agree that while the bar chart, the way it is really interesting as an overall impression, it's hard to draw conclusions from it without really sitting down and working through it. Yeah. I like the call to action. I think I'd love for it to be more visual, and that is the big PowerPoint fan in me coming through. Like I like even things like a circle, a colorful circle around the numbers to make them pop. Maybe you have a grid of, well, these are 8 calls to action, but if it was 9, you could do like 3 by 3, and you could have all these like little panels, and maybe as you click on one, something happens, or even just visually. I think when it's just text, it feels a bit like work to read through them, but I love that it's included.
Yeah. And by the way, Michelle's the first one that has really put a lot of like all the logos in. I think there was another one that had Focus 2030, but thank you. It's always great for us to have, good branding on this. This is about raising awareness about the movement, about the organizations. And of course, if you can, give a link for people to support financially any of these organizations, that's always super helpful.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if I can do, we can do one more, if I can find my mouse. So we have Bridget next, and she's created this. Looks like she's used Figma as well in her process. She did include the hashtag. And here we have one of those, I don't know what to call them, like a rounded bar chart with a dot in the middle, like a slider almost, like a slider chart there. Perceptions of gender inequality. Okay, so there's a bit of a context first, and I think this time, because it's not as much text, but also because it visually is a bit separate from the viz, it's a bit easier to digest, right?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Okay, I don't know what the big circles are. That's the different questions. Okay, I find that a bit much because I don't know why it's red, and I just, like, visually it really distracts me from everything else. All I see are these circles, and I don't know why they're there. Maybe it could instead be, if you want to keep the circle, maybe the word education, and then it could be crises, it could be, biology or whatever, like just a summary word, and then, for people to hover, but, okay, if I click on one of them, physically strong. Ooh, I like the animations. Have you clicked yet?
Yeah, I've been clicking it. It's very cool.
That's really neat. Oh, I like that.
Yeah, me too. It's really pretty.
I'm not totally sold on the 3 colors just because they're all really intense. So we've got purple, greenish, turquoise, and red. I don't know if total needs a color because the red is just a bit... Red to me always reminds me of school when you made a mistake and the teacher marked it in red. So maybe that could be like just dark gray, like a neutral color. That would be quite helpful, I think.
Yeah, the red is definitely really strong. Yeah, I think it's really pretty, and like particularly how the animation's working. And I really like in this one that you have kind of the aggregate view with the big red dots. You can see like what people collectively are valuing, and then you can see within those countries what they think is really important. The one thing I think is kind of missing from here, and it might be possible to do it with the colors of the bars rather than using a gradient, is like the difference between men and women, right? Like if you go to unpaid work and you look at Japan, for example, it literally looks like men and women perceive it the same, and it looks like the bars 60% of female and 39% of male, and I guess that's because of where it's landing on the axis, so it makes it look the same, but it's not, it's like a material difference, and you can't really see that. You would expect like one line to be longer, and maybe that's just, I'm not sure why that is, because I'm just trying to work out like why that would happen. Like why is the white dot just put in the middle of the range every time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not. Well, the white dot is that is what the total field was. So, for example, for Japan, it's 50% of all respondents said that's the main reason. But for United States, it's only 27% for the domestic work. So that does change. And then the rest is the range. So women responded here. I guess the problem is because they're connected. If it was just a circle to the left for the male and the women on the right to female, for Japan in this case, you would see, women are so much further. But because we have that central dot for the total number, we only look at, how far is it from the center? They're both the same. Like we read it like a butterfly chart. The center is 0 and we go left and right, but the center is actually, in this case, 50%, and that's across the population of the sample. So I think that's what makes it confusing.
Yeah, because isn't it going to be like skewed, right? So if you have something like Japan where 60% of women thought it and 39% of men thought it, right? And because you have more women having answered, that middle point is going to skew more towards the higher number. So it makes it look smaller. So there's something tricky with this. I think the viz is very cool. I would try to figure out, how to make the disparity in perception within, between men and women within a country to be more clear. Whether it's taking out that dot, the dot makes you immediately say one side is the men, one side is the women. At least it makes me do that.
I think we agree that the approach is great. It's just not visually all that obvious. So maybe reworking some of that, and then I would just rethink the colors a bit. I don't mind the the purple and the green, but there are too many colors for me here because we also have red and white and blue and black. Like maybe just thinking, how could you remove some of the color to make the real message stand out? Because at the moment, the big circles stand out. I would prefer if the viz popped out more.
Yeah, cool animation though, and it is nice looking.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to bring us back on the screen for a little closing out. Let me just grab Zoom. Okay, here we are. Oh, that never really works, but let's try again. Okay. Oh, it's getting very dark in here. I need a bit more light from all my various screens. I'm just going to be dark.
At least you put your reflectors on, you know, like you're kind of glowing.
I know, I'm glowing in my exercise gear, but I'm not wearing for exercise, I'm just being lazy. Yeah, thank you both for joining this show and giving your feedback. I think it's been really helpful for people, and I hope they understand the challenges of these kind of data sets that just need a bit more thinking and no rushing and a bit more words probably.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I thought it was the work. I actually really liked all the visits that we saw, you know, we didn't get to see a ton of them. It's because they evoked conversation and discussion, and I think that's like a credit to the people who built the stuff.
Yeah.
So, and as always, you know, this is really a fascinating journey with all of you, and we're really grateful for everything that you've contributed, and we are, you know. This is like the 1 year anniversary, essentially, right? This is part of why we did this set, because it was capturing the dimensionality of all that we've done in the last year. And we are thinking and talking and planning about what's going to happen in the future. And we'll have more to come on that soon. But we're going to be going deeper and bigger. So stay tuned, everybody. And Eva, as always, thank you so much for hosting and for giving us the opportunity to engage with the community.
My pleasure, and I hope everyone learns something and took something away, and we look forward to seeing everyone update their visits and tweet them out again to let us know. And yeah, and then at the end of the week, I'll be posting favorites. All right, thank you guys, and we'll leave it at that. Have a nice rest of the day, everyone, and speak soon.